Discussing the political fallout from the government's escaping the Dáil confidence vote yesterday, held in the wake of last week's fuel protests, while the coalition held on. The shock resignation of Michael Healy-Rae has raised serious questions about unity in government and growing frustration, particularly in rural Ireland. And the government, no doubt, will today be assessing, overlooking the impact of the Healy-Rae brothers, Michael and his brother Danny, pulling their support for the coalition, which means its majority has dropped to 5. But rather than the government being in a bind or a tight spot, the Enterprise Minister Peter Burke says it's actually the opposition who are all over the place.
The coalition is very resolute, it is very strong, it has a very significant margin, but one critical thing is, for the $250 million intervention and the intervention last night, these are financial resolutions giving money back to people. The opposition voted all over the place on them, and Sinn Féin opposed the reduction in fuel for petrol, opposed the reduction in fuel for diesel, and opposed the reduction for contractors.
So, do you agree with Minister Peter Burke? Is it the opposition who are all over the place, or is it the government who need to pause for some self-reflection and see where they go next? 0818 400 964. Give us a call on this or send your views in via text or WhatsApp. And I know there'll be many views on the government, particularly we've heard so much in relation to the fuel protests. So it's 086 1800 964. For more on this, I'm joined on the line by the former Clare Minister Tony Killeen. Tony, great to have you on again. Thanks for joining us.
Good morning, Alan.
So the government survived this confidence vote, and in fairness, 92-78, a decent margin. But how significant do you feel this moment is politically? Is it just routine Dáil drama or a sign of deeper instability?
Well, it's certainly a step above routine, I'd say. Most of it would have been anticipated, apart from the defection of the two Healy-Raes, as you said, really. But Michael stepping down as the Minister of State wasn't foreseen, as far as I can see, by anybody, even by people quite close to him. And what he'd been saying, particularly the day before, in relation to the new package, sounded very positive, and he seemed to be happy with it. But there was a lot of pressure. There is always a lot of pressure on TDs, even in fairly normal times. And I suspect, but I've no reason for saying this except for my experience of being a Minister of State and being a minister, I suspect that Michael may have been disappointed with the level of impact that he was having as Minister for Forestry. It's hugely frustrating to be trying to move policy forward and to get results quickly. Generally speaking, you don't get results quickly. And I suspect that may have been a factor, but I've no reason other than my experience of being there to say that.
Tony, I just wonder though, do you think as well he may have been hearing, as we know on the show, hearing a lot of strong views from people on these protests and the government and how they've approached it, particularly you think of the Healy-Rae base, the people from an agricultural background, hauliers, contractors, so on, and that I'm sure he was hearing a lot of unvarnished views down in the kingdom as to what is going on and how they feel he should be handling this situation.
Of course he was, and he has always been in opposition up to the last year and a half or so he's not used to that. And that is very difficult. And of course they do have the added strategic difficulty that they have to win 2 seats in a 5-seater, which is very, very difficult. In all other cases, the independents are not single-issue candidates, but single candidates in their own constituencies. In their case, they need to get 40% for 2 quarters, but they need to get well over 30% to pull off the second seat. So that's an additional consideration for them. But I do think that he probably couldn't have been accustomed to the level of frustration and anger that he was exposed to. And the most difficult part, I think, for nearly all politicians, even people in opposition, is that it was so unfocused. The catalyst in some senses was the fuel prices, which arise pretty much directly from the war in Iran and a little from the war in Ukraine. But almost everybody who was protesting had a list of issues that was bothering them, some of them far away from the ones bothering the fuel protest people, and the incoherence of the ask made it very difficult for people trying to put together the answer.
Yeah, I can see that. I just wonder now, will the government look at it going forward? Their majorities drop to 5. how difficult or otherwise that makes it for them going forward, and any other potential future votes or confidence motions, which you would have to say, do the opposition smell blood? Will they be coming with more no confidence motions, given some people view, Tony, the government's 15 or so months in power as not quite getting out of the starting blocks at top pace. There's been, we talked a lot about the first couple of months and the speaking rights and all of the hoo-ha around that. There was the last October's budget. The middle class left displeased. I know there's always elements that are not pleased with budgets because somebody feels like they're losing out. And there's been other issues as well. And now we have obviously the fuel protests. It just feels like this government has never really gotten going.
Well, you're right to look to the impact on the future, and my guess is that the next big difficult point is the budget in October, because the 750 million or plus cost of the current package is really for a very limited period and is projected to the end of July. Anytime you introduce something like this, it's very difficult, as they found previously, to pull back from it, as was the case with the previous packages that were in place. And I think there will be flashpoints at that stage. But putting together a budget with these kind of amounts missing, and this 750 million projected, in my opinion, in all likelihood, will run to over $1 billion. And everybody is saying that we have budget surplus, but you don't really shout about a budget surplus when you're sitting on a national debt of 230 billion. And you really have to be looking over your shoulder at that. And you also have to be looking forward at what you can do in terms of addressing issues like the housing issue, obviously, and issues like child poverty, where the government have introduced the school meals more recently, and a number of targeted measures. Generally speaking, targeted measures are better. But when you do targeted measures, everybody who doesn't benefit directly says, there they go again, looking after that crowd and leaving me out. And the statement from ICTU on Monday, I think, will have sent a chill down the backbone of government.
Yeah.
Because it very clearly said, everybody else is getting some of this action, we want ours.
And and we're joined in studio by the former Clare TD Madeline Taylor-Quinn. Madeline, that point I was going to make as well, that as the government, and maybe they sensed that coming up with a further support package was going to beget this potential outcome, but they had no choice but to do it given the strength and anger around the fuel protests. But by coming up with another 505 million, the unions will be looking and going, well, you have more money. We know you have more money, and we're going to be negotiating hard and strong. And we've seen the way in which the protest came about, and we know that gets results.
Yes, that is true. It's true, not true in a sense. The unions, in fairness to the unions, they have conducted in recent years a very civilised approach of negotiation, and negotiations have proven to be very successful.
Yeah, and I suppose, look, I'm not saying they're going to be blockading the roads, but they know the government can't play the poor mouth with them.
I don't believe they do. Yes, of course, but we're in a situation right now internationally where there's absolute huge volatility, and while there may be a rainy day front here in Ireland, the realities are we have no idea what's the situation internationally going to be 2 months down the road, 3 months down the road, and we have no clue as to what call there may be. And I think we have to be really careful. I think the good thing right now is, and the positive thing, is that a good package has come out of the discussions. And in fairness to the government, they were already discussing the second tranche of the package right through Easter week and up along. And I can understand how the protesters became anxious and became saying that things aren't happening fast enough.
Yeah, and sorry to cut across you, Madeline, but you say a good package. I mean, for the people we're hearing from, the protesters we've had on, and other people texting in, There's nobody, very few, if any, messages or views expressed on the show describing it as a good package. It just seems like nobody's pleased with it.
Well, all I can say is there's an awful lot of people that I know that are very happy, that have to travel to work from here all over different parts of County Clare. They have to travel to Galway and to Limerick and to wherever and spend a lot of money weekly on petrol. Are very, very pleased that there is a reduction of 10 cents per litre on their petrol and on their diesel, and it'll make quite a difference again.
But for how long? Because we saw the previous cuts were gobbled up by rising prices.
But we know the price is still a way too high, but that is something totally outside the control of the government. The situation that is currently here is something that has not been created by government, is not controlled by government, and over which they have no control to change, because we're in a war. We're in a war situation, and it's wartime. So that's why we have to be very prudent going forward, not to be in any way reckless with whatever ready fund there is there. The good thing is, people express their views, and that is, and protest is good, and I think it's good sometimes that the government, does get a little prod to wake up. They were doing the work, but the bottom line was it wasn't happening fast enough. But the big issue in all of this, and I think the one lesson the government should learn out of this is, we had 3 points of strategic interest in this country, with Galway, with Foynes, and we had Whitegate. How it emerged that those 3 strategic points of entry for essential services into Ireland were blocked is beyond me.
They should be deemed critical infrastructure going forward.
Critical infrastructure, and I believe the government should have had an intelligence and knowledge that there was a plan to do something around those. So I do believe there is a need for government to seriously examine the intelligence services of the state and to set up an oversight Oireachtas Intelligence Committee.
Okay, and
to ensure that the likes of that does not happen again.
Okay, you've made a point there, I suppose, about things not happening quickly enough, and I want to come back to how both of your views on how the government could or perhaps should have handled this. But Tony, the point about the money, and it's not defending the government, but are they in a lose-lose situation here? As I say, nobody from reaction on the show seems to be particularly pleased with this package. Economists would say, given the instability globally, that you should not be spending willy-nilly, but no one's happy with the package. And I did mention last October's budget, the middle class not best pleased, feeling there was little, if any, nothing in it for them. And perhaps there was a Sunday Times front page story recently that the government was cognizant of the disquiet amongst the middle class and would look to do something for them in this October's budget. But now, is there less wriggle room there, and are they ultimately going to be unhappy as well?
Yeah, there is less wriggle room. I mean, depending on how long this goes on, and Madeline quite rightly said, most of it, 95% of it, arises from international conflicts that we have no control over and that, quite frankly, don't look like ending very soon. That's one part of it that is outside government's control. The second part is that a popular government is almost invariably a bad government. The nature of what government has to do absolutely means that very unpopular decisions are required very frequently. And if the measure by which you judged the actions of government were how popular it was or how unpopular it was, you'd be making a very serious mistake in terms of the future financial and other well-being of the country. And I suppose the mistake and we all made this mistake in government, and every government everywhere makes it anyway, is that we don't differentiate between the reality and the perception. Ministers and their officials and so forth spend days and weeks, and in this case, as Madeline rightly said, they knew when they introduced the first part of the package that there would be a second part, and they were debating to and fro all the impacts and being told in the middle of it by the ESRI that the biggest mistake that was made in the 70s and 80s, both times, was cutting the excise duty on fuel, because it led to fuel shortages on both occasions ultimately. And against all that background, government ministers are debating all that. But of course we're outside and we don't know, we don't have access to the considerations that went into making the decision. So we're out in perception territory. And perception nowadays isn't even I was going to say, isn't shaped by the media. I don't know if it's even impacted much by the media, because all of the perception currently pretty much comes from social media. And there are big players in social media influencing perceptions that, no government could deal with. But I do think that one of the things the government will have to do is get better at explaining why decisions were reached and finding opportunities in mainstream media, obviously, which is the easiest place to do it because you're treated respectably or with respect. Whereas on social media, politicians who engage probably feel that they shouldn't because of the keyboard warriors that they draw down on themselves.
But let me put that point to Madeline. If we look at the government and where there should be some self-reflection there, is that one of the issues? They need to get better at communication, how they convey messages to the public. There was criticism of how they handled the protests, and what Micheál Martin was saying, the parliamentary party meeting earlier in the week for Fianna Fáil, reportedly criticism of Micheál Martin, that he can be affable with fellow members, but he can come across to the public as too narky, and that rubs the public up the wrong way.
I suppose you can understand being in government is not for the faint-hearted. That's the reality. And if you are to govern, you are going to have to take very unpopular decisions, as Tony rightly said. It's not easy for people in government to make decisions and take everything into consideration. Yes, you can understand how these ministers are all caught up in cabinet meetings, caught up in departmental meetings, all of that, and they come their heads full of whatever is going on in the department and come out on media, and then they nearly need to space themselves from the department and the public and actually get into the frame of mind. Well, where are the public at right now? How are the public thinking? How are the public feeling?
That was a point I put to Colin Crowe earlier in the week on foot of that poll in the Sunday Independent, that you look at those in favour of the protests and against the protests, that it was the majority of those supporting opposition or independent parties hugely in favour of the protests, and maybe was the government in one of those kind of, as we say in social media, echo chambers. Yeah.
Well, you see, that's where there's a kind of a disconnect, and you can understand how that arises. So if you were to give them an advice, I'd say listen to the people on the ground, listen to the people who are out there working, listen to the people who are trying to make a living, who are trying to pay taxes, listen to all the difficulties. And in fairness, they were listening, and they were working right through Easter week trying to put this package that has just come out in the past few days.
So you don't think that there was calls for the Dáil to come back from its Easter break early?
But
the optics of it, whatever the realities are, the optics did not look good to the public.
You've got to deal with it between optics and reality. The reality was the Dáil itself wasn't actually going to pull together a package or sit down and work out the details of a package. That package had to be worked out within the Department of Finance, within the Department of Agriculture, and any other everyday transport, and all the departments that were involved. It had to be worked out internally within those departments and between those departments, and eventually come together along with the representative organisations. And I would like to take this opportunity of complimenting the representatives of the various organisations who for the past number of weeks have engaged with government ministers and with departments in negotiating and putting their case forward around this particular deal. A lot of time and a lot of effort was put in by all of those people on a voluntary basis.
Okay, we know a lot of the protesters are saying that they felt those organisations didn't represent them. I suppose just to finish, where do we go from here, Tony? People pointing out that nothing's been done for home heating oil. Perhaps is the government looking to hold on to money to do something as we get closer to winter when it'll be really needed? And what can the government do to rebuild trust, particularly in rural Ireland? And is there work that needs to be done between the coalition partners themselves? You look at the reports from Jim O'Callaghan, Helen McEntee and so on. Is there work that needs to be done there to ensure this government has a bit more road left to run?
Yeah, well, if a group of ministers forget to tell one of their own ministerial colleagues about whatever decision they've made or whatever is happening, it's no wonder they'd forget to tell the rest of us, realistically. So, when you're in that pressure situation and you're trying to come up with a package, you very often exclude all the other considerations, and that's not helpful for the message that's getting out. So that's something that needs to be done better, but is never done better because what's happening is being done under such pressure. But to answer the other part of your question, the government will be looking, I think the government will be looking immediately at the October budget. Now, of course, some work has been done on that already, but I think they'll be looking very carefully at what leeway they have for, say, a winter package on home heating oil. And as they move towards taking some action on that, you will hear the Central Bank and the ESRI and the Fiscal Advisory Council and several other bodies who have future proofing responsibilities saying to them, what you're considering doing is against the long-term national interest, because it's going to cost way more money than you can currently provide for. There's a very volatile international situation. You've got 2.8 million people employed. You have to take action that ensures that their jobs are secure, kept, particularly, I suppose, in industry, are kept safe. And you also have to work towards getting more houses built, which is a lot more expensive now because the inflation in the building sector will not be easily rolled back. In fact, I think will not be rolled back.
Okay.
And likewise with poverty and homelessness. Well, children's poverty in particular, which the government have been making huge efforts to address, and mostly being criticised for the provisions that they've put in place, which are quite expensive.
Okay, I'm conscious of time very much against us. Of 30 seconds left, Madeline. I'll finish with yourself and maybe a response to a message that's been sent in by listeners on 086 1800 964 saying the blame game is on. Fianna Fáil and Fine Gael are trying to point the finger at each other. Touching on, as I mentioned, Jim O'Callaghan, Helen McAtee, the listener also mentioning Patrick O'Donovan and his unhappiness with, he felt, the coverage in the media of the protests, and he was going to go to Commission Naman. Now he's rescinded that. Independents like the Healy-Raes pointing the finger at Micheál Martin and Simon Harris, but mainly Micheál Martin and Peter Burke, as we heard at the top of the piece, now trying to pretend that the opposition are at 6s and 7s. General election to happen within 12 months. I'm calling it now. Well, should this listener be putting money on that, Madeline?
No, if I were that listener, I would definitely not put money on that, absolutely, because I think what last night has shown that the government is very cohesive with a majority. They won the motion of confidence with a majority.
Is 5 enough, do you think, going forward?
14. Of course 5 is more than enough. I was part of a party that was in government between 82 and 87 with a majority of 1, and we survived for nearly 5 years with a majority of 1.
Were you facing a geopolitical climate like we're facing now?
No, at that stage, no, there wasn't, but there were huge strains on the Irish economy, and there were international issues as well that were affecting it at that stage, and there was huge pressure, and there was a lot of, so you know what, government and being an elected public representative is not for the faint-hearted, and the reality is I think they need to show their mettle, and I think people also need to appreciate we're in a wartime situation.
Okay, we are no doubt going to get a lot more on that. Madeline, thank you very much, and Tony, thanks as well. Madeline Taylor-Quinn and Tony Killeen with us on Morning Focus.